A quiet wonders story. If you believe the world still arranges its own small miracles on ordinary Saturday mornings, stay a while. This is one of those stories, the kind that starts with nothing more than leaves falling and a stranger's coffee going cold, and ends up rearranging two lives that had no idea they were waiting for each other. He was sitting on a park bench with a coffee he'd stopped tasting 20 minutes earlier, watching the leaves come down in the particular unhurried way they come down in October when there's no wind at all, just gravity, just time doing the only thing time knows how to do. He wasn't thinking about anything in particular. That was the whole point of the bench. Simon Ashford came to Horner Park most Saturday mornings when his mind needed somewhere quiet to be, somewhere that wasn't the apartment, wasn't the workshop, wasn't the inside of the grief he'd been carrying for 2 years now, a grief he'd grown so used to that some mornings he forgot it was grief at all and simply mistook it for the shape he'd become. He was thinking about nothing. Then 4 small girls in matching forest green coats and matching mustard yellow beanies stopped directly in front of his bench, and the one closest to him looked at his forearm, pointed, and said the sentence that stopped the entire world from turning for a second. "Our mom has a tattoo just like yours." He looked at the little girl. He looked down at the tattoo on his own forearm, the one he'd gotten 11 years ago, the one that wasn't a common design pulled off some studio's flash wall, but something specific and deeply personal that he'd drawn himself on a night when he was 27 years old and feeling something he couldn't put into words, so he'd put it into ink instead. He looked back up at the 4 little girls. He froze. His name was Simon Ashford. He was 38 years old, and he had a tattoo on his right forearm that he'd designed himself at 27, built from 3 elements that mattered to him in a way he'd never fully explained to anyone who'd asked, and not many people had asked. A compass with a broken needle. A single stem with no flower on it. A small bird caught mid-flight, not arriving anywhere, not leaving anywhere, simply suspended in the space between. He'd taken the sketch to a tattoo artist named Theo Lindqvist, who ran a small studio off Damon Avenue in Wicker Park, and Theo had looked at the drawing for a long time before saying, "This is the saddest happy thing I've ever been asked to put on somebody." Simon had said, "Yeah." Theo had said, "I'll do it right." He had. Simon had worn that tattoo for 11 years. Hundreds of people had seen it over the years, at the gym, at the lumberyard, at the occasional summer barbecue where he'd rolled his sleeves up against the heat. A handful had asked what it meant. Nobody had ever said anything that made him feel it had been truly, fully seen, not once, not in 11 years, until a 7-year-old girl in a public park pointed at it and said those 8 words. He sat very still. The 4 girls watched him with the patient, assessing expression of children who have asked an adult a real question and are waiting to see whether the adult will answer honestly, or do the thing adults sometimes do, which is give a different, smaller answer than the one the question actually deserved. "Your mom has the same one," he said. The girl who'd pointed shook her head. "Not the same. Similar same. The bird is different. Hers is landing." Something moved in his chest that he couldn't immediately name. "What's your mom's name?" he asked. A woman's voice came from behind the girls, sharp with the particular urgency of a parent recovering ground. "Girls! Come here, please. Right now." He looked up. She was walking toward them quickly from the direction of the playground, her dark hair moving behind her, her face carrying the specific expression of a parent who has lost visual contact with 4 children for 90 seconds and has already run the full calculation of everything that could have gone wrong in that time. She reached the girls and put her hands on the nearest 2, instinctively, the checking hands, the "we are all here and accounted for" hands. She looked at Simon. He looked at her. She looked at his arm. The park didn't go quiet. Parks don't. Somewhere behind her, children were still shouting, a dog was moving through a drift of fallen leaves, and the city carried on at its ordinary volume all around them. But something went quiet anyway, in the small circle of space between the bench and the woman standing in front of it. "Where did you get that?" she asked. "I drew it 11 years ago," he said. "I had it done by a guy named Theo, off Damon." "Theo Lindqvist," she said. "He retired last year." "I heard that." She looked at him. He looked at her. The 4 girls looked at both of them with the bright, interested attention of children who understand that something is happening well above their current level of information but well below their threshold for boredom. "I'm Elena," she said. Simon. Your bird is between, she said. Yours is landing, he said. She sat down on the bench. Not because she'd decided to, not because she'd thought it through in any conscious way, but simply because her legs had done the thing legs sometimes do when the body needs a moment and the nearest horizontal surface happens to be right there. The girls arranged themselves loosely around the bench, the way children do when they've correctly identified that the adults are about to talk and have decided to allow it, while staying close enough in case anything more interesting happened. Her name was Elena Ferris. She was 36 years old, and she had 4 daughters: Ivy, Wren, Sage, and Fern, 7 years old, identical in the way that makes strangers stop dead on the sidewalk and stare, something her daughters had been subjected to for their entire lives and had developed a collective policy toward that ranged from patient tolerance to theatrical, eye-rolling annoyance, depending entirely on the day and exactly who was doing the staring. She'd gotten her own tattoo 8 years earlier, 6 months after her husband had left, not in anger, not dramatically, but in the quiet, devastating way of someone who had decided, with a clarity Elena had eventually come to respect even though at the time it had felt like being handed a door and told to go find somewhere else to stand, that the life he was living was not the one he actually wanted. She'd been 28 years old with infant quadruplets and a marriage that had just quietly become a co-parenting arrangement, and a sense of her own future that had gone completely illegible overnight, like a page of handwriting left out in the rain. She'd gotten the tattoo because she needed something permanent on her own body that belonged only to her, that meant something only she had chosen, in a life that had suddenly stopped feeling like it belonged to her at all. She'd sketched it herself: a compass with a broken needle, a single stem with no flower, a bird coming in to land. She'd gone to Theo Lindqvist on Damon because a friend had recommended him. He'd looked at her sketch for a long time. "This is the saddest happy thing I've ever been asked to put on someone," he'd said. She'd stared at him. "Someone else said that to you?" "Once. A few years back." "What did you tell them?" "That I'd do it right." She sat on the bench in the October park now, looking at Simon's arm and then at his face, thinking about Theo saying those exact words to 2 strangers years apart, neither of them knowing the other existed, both of them walking out of his shop with ink on their arms that had come, somehow, from the same quiet place, even though they'd never met until this particular morning. "The broken compass," she said. "For the time you don't know where you're going," he said. "The stem with no flower. For the thing that hasn't happened yet. The bird. Between. Still figuring it out." "Mine is landing," she said. "So you figured it out." She looked over at her 4 daughters, who were now investigating a pile of fallen leaves with the focused, collaborative energy of a small research team. "I figured out the most important part," she said. "The rest I'm still working on." He nodded, and for a moment neither of them said anything else, because there was nothing that needed saying immediately, and they had both learned, in their own separate and difficult ways, the value of not filling a silence that was already doing useful work on its own. They talked for the better part of an hour that first morning, though not about the tattoo again after the first few minutes. About the daughters Ivy, Wren, Sage, and Fern, which Simon said sounded either like a folk album or a very small law firm, and Elena laughed in a way that used her whole face, the kind of laugh that surprised her a little on its way out, like she hadn't used that particular muscle in a while. About his work, which was carpentry and joinery, custom furniture, the kind of slow, deliberate work where you spend a long time with a piece of wood understanding what it actually wants to become before you decide what you're going to make of it. About her work, which was pediatric occupational therapy 3 days a week at a clinic on the north side, and raising 4 children the other 4 days, which she said with the flat, exhausted honesty of someone who had stopped pretending the math added up to anything restful. About what it's like to be alone in a way that isn't lonely exactly, but is aware of its own particular weight, the way you're aware of a coat you've worn so long you've forgotten you're wearing it until somebody asks why you never take it off. About grief. Not dramatically. Just the plain, unhurried way 2 people talk about grief once they've both carried it long enough to stop being afraid of the word. He told her about the 2 years. He didn't explain what the 2 years meant, not exactly, not in specific dates and details, but she understood from the particular way he said it, the small pause before the number, the way his jaw set slightly, that it meant the kind of 2 years that has a before and an after, and that the after was where he was currently standing, still finding its shape. What he didn't say that first morning, and what he would only tell her much later, on a night many weeks on when the girls were asleep at their grandmother's and the 2 of them were sitting on his back porch with the last of a bottle of wine between them, was that 2 years earlier his younger brother Alec had died in a car accident on the Kennedy Expressway during an ice storm in February, on his way home from visiting Simon's workshop, where the two of them had spent the evening arguing cheerfully about whether a particular walnut table Simon was building needed a fourth coat of oil or was simply being fussed over past the point of usefulness. Alec had left a little after 10. He'd called Simon from the road 20 minutes later, laughing about a text their mother had sent, and then the call had simply ended, the way calls do when a signal drops, except this one hadn't dropped. Simon had learned that 3 hours later, from a police officer standing in his doorway at 1 a.m, holding a hat he kept turning over in his hands like he wasn't sure what to do with it either. Simon had built the walnut table anyway, finished it the following week with the fourth coat of oil Alec had argued for, because it had seemed, at the time, like the only decision he still had any right to make. The table sat in his own dining room now, the one piece of furniture in his apartment he'd never once considered selling, though he'd built and sold dozens of others just as fine over the years. The tattoo, the compass with the broken needle, the stem with no flower, the bird between arriving and leaving, he'd drawn all of it a full 4 years before Alec died, back when he was 27 and going through an entirely different kind of unmooring, a breakup that had felt catastrophic at the time and now seemed almost quaint in comparison to what came later. But he told Elena, that night on the porch, that the design had taken on a second meaning after Alec's death that he'd never planned for and never fully explained to anyone, not even to himself in so many words, until he tried to say it out loud to her. The bird between arriving and leaving had started, somewhere in that second year, to feel less like a description of heartbreak and more like a description of grief itself, the strange suspended state of loving someone who is permanently, irreversibly between being here and being gone, existing now only in memory, in a walnut table, in the particular way certain jokes still almost got told out loud before Simon caught himself. Elena didn't try to fix any of it when he told her. She didn't offer the kind of tidy, well-meaning consolation that Simon had learned, over 2 years, to brace himself against and privately resent. She just sat with him on the porch, quiet, her hand eventually finding his on the armrest between them, and said, "That's an unbearably beautiful thing to have done with a broken heart. Building him a table with a fourth coat of oil, just because he was right. It was the least useless thing I could think of," Simon said. "It wasn't useless at all," Elena said. "It's the opposite of useless. It's the only kind of thing that actually helps." What Elena hadn't said, that first morning on the bench, and what she would only tell Simon in full much later, was the actual shape of what had happened 8 years earlier, when her husband Daniel had left. They'd married young, at 24, both of them still finishing graduate programs, both of them still under the impression that love mostly worked itself out if you simply loved each other hard enough and showed up for the ordinary parts of life without complaint. The quadruplets had been a shock in the purest sense of the word, unassisted, unexpected, for heartbeats on one ultrasound screen where they'd been braced, at most, for 2. Elena remembered the technician going quiet, then leaving the room to get someone else, and Daniel gripping her hand so hard it left a mark, and both of them laughing in the particular hysterical way people laugh when a piece of news is too large to process through any of the normal channels. The first year had nearly destroyed them both, in the ordinary, well-documented way that 4 infants nearly destroys any 2 people, no matter how much they love each other going in. Elena remembered entire weeks that existed only as a blur of feedings and diaper changes and a sleep deprivation so complete it had started to feel like a physical location she lived in rather than a temporary condition she was passing through. Daniel had been present for most of it, exhausted in the same shared way she was, and for a while she'd believed they were simply 2 people surviving something hard together, the way you're supposed to. She hadn't seen it building, not the way she came to understand, much later, that it had been building. Daniel had gone quiet in a specific way starting around the girl's first birthday, a quietness she'd mistaken for exhaustion because exhaustion was the explanation that required nothing further from her, no deeper reckoning with what might actually be happening underneath it. He'd started staying later at the office. He'd started, she realized only in retrospect, rehearsing a version of a conversation he hadn't yet had the courage to start. He told her on a Tuesday evening in March, the girl's not yet 18 months old, sitting across from her at their kitchen table with his hands folded in a way that already told her, before he said a single word, that whatever was coming had been decided long before that moment, and that nothing she said in response was going to change the outcome, only the manner of it. "I don't think I'm the person I thought I was going to be," he'd said. "I don't think this is the life I actually wanted, and I think staying in and out of guilt is worse for both of us than being honest about it now." She told Simon much later, wanted very badly to hate him for that sentence, and had, for a period of roughly 2 years, managed to hate him quite thoroughly and quite completely. But somewhere in the years since, worn down by the plain, unglamorous work of actually raising 4 children on largely her own steam, with Daniel present in a diminished, dutiful, co-parenting capacity that never quite closed the distance he'd opened that Tuesday evening, she had come, slowly and without ever quite deciding to respect the honesty of what he'd said, even while still resenting the timing of when he'd said it. He wasn't wrong that it wasn't the life he wanted, she told Simon. He was wrong about when to say it, and how much of the hardest part he left me holding alone. Those are different kinds of wrong. I've made my peace with one of them. I'm still working on the other. The 2 years that followed Daniel's departure had been, by any reasonable measure, the hardest of Elena's life, harder, she suspected, in some ways, than Simon's 2 years had been, though she never once said that out loud to him, understanding instinctively that grief doesn't rank itself usefully against other grief, that the exercise of comparison rarely does anyone any good. She'd finished her graduate program 2 semesters behind schedule, studying with an infant asleep against her chest and 3 others in a rotating system of borrowed cribs at her mother's house. She'd taken the occupational therapy position at the pediatric clinic the moment she was licensed, not because it was her dream job exactly, but because it offered health insurance and a schedule flexible enough to survive 4 small children on her own. She'd gotten the tattoo 6 months into all of it, in that specific stretch of time when the shock had worn off enough to leave room for something else to move in, not quite anger, not quite grief, something more like a fierce, deliberate claiming of whatever pieces of herself hadn't been consumed entirely by feedings and diaper changes and the slow, grinding work of rebuilding a future she hadn't chosen out of the wreckage of one she had. I needed something on my body that was only mine, she told Simon. Everything else that year belonged to somebody else's need, the girls, Daniel's absence, my mother's worry. The tattoo was the one thing in that entire year that was purely, only mine. The bird landing, Simon said. I drew it landing because I needed to believe, even when I didn't believe it yet, that I was eventually going to come down somewhere solid. That the whole thing wasn't just going to keep spinning forever. She looked at her own arm for a moment. It took about 4 more years before I actually believed it. But I think that's roughly how long anything worth believing usually takes. We want to pause here, because this bench, this particular October morning, this meeting that felt like something more than coincidence, didn't happen in a vacuum. It happened because of a long chain of small decisions made by ordinary people who will never fully know what they set in motion, and who never asked to know. There was a woman named Billionaire, who had been Elena's neighbor through the hardest first year after Daniel left. Priya had 3 children of her own and no extra hours anywhere in her day, and had nonetheless shown up at Elena's door nearly every Thursday evening for the better part of 6 months with a container of whatever she'd cooked that week, along with a standing, unspoken offer to sit with the girls so Elena could shower, or sleep, or simply sit alone in a quiet room and remember what it felt like to be a single person again instead of the sole operating system for 4 other lives. Priya had never once announced this as an act of kindness. She'd never framed it, never asked for thanks, never mentioned it to anyone else on the block. She'd simply knocked on Thursdays and kept knocking, long after most people would have assumed the crisis had passed and the casseroles were no longer strictly necessary. There was a pediatrician named Dr. Alvarez, who had told Elena once, almost offhandedly, between the chaos of a routine 4-child checkup, that children who get regular unstructured outdoor time tend to develop a particular ease in the world that indoor children often have to work harder to find later on. It was a small thing to say, delivered in the rushed cadence of a doctor running 20 minutes behind on a Tuesday morning. Elena had gone home and written it down on a sticky note she kept on her refrigerator for years afterward, and had built an entire Saturday morning ritual around that single sentence, a ritual she had not missed, rain or shine or exhaustion, in 4 straight years. Dr. Alvarez had no idea she'd created a standing Saturday tradition. She had simply said a thing she genuinely believed. And there was a man named Desmond Okafor, who ran the small coffee cart near the Montrose entrance to Horner Park, and who had been making Simon Saturday coffee for nearly 2 years, ever since Simon had started coming to the park not long after Alex's funeral. Desmond had started adding an extra shot of espresso to Simon's order about 6 months back, without ever being asked, because he'd noticed the particular tiredness Simon carried into the park some Saturdays, the tiredness of a week that had been too long and a weekend that hadn't yet offered anything restorative to make up for it. Desmond had never mentioned the extra shot. Simon had never asked why the coffee had started tasting a little stronger, a little more capable of holding him upright through the quiet hour he needed on that bench. Priya's Thursday visits had put Elena back together enough, in that first terrible year, to keep going at all. Dr. Alvarez's offhand comment had built the Saturday ritual that brought 4 girls in matching green coats to that particular park on that particular morning. Desmond's extra shot of espresso had kept Simon sitting on that bench a little longer than he otherwise might have, long enough to still be there when 4 small girls came walking past. None of them knew each other. None of them knew they were quietly arranging anything at all. They were simply people being decent to other people in the small, daily, unremarkable ways that turn out, on closer inspection, not to be unremarkable in the slightest. This is the thread this whole story is built from, not fate exactly, nothing so grand or so easily named, but the ordinary, cumulative weight of people choosing kindness on days when nobody was watching and nobody was going to thank them for it. The girls came back periodically that first morning to report on the leaves, then returned to their investigation with the seriousness of a small research team convinced they were on the verge of an important discovery. Ren, who had been the one to point at the tattoo, came back at one point and stood beside Simon, studying his arm again with the focused attention of someone verifying a memory against the original. "Yours is a better bird," she announced. "Yours is a braver one," Simon said. She considered this seriously, the way she considered most important things. "How do you know?" "Because landing takes more courage than flying," he said. She looked at her mother, then back at him. "Mom says that too." Then she went back to the leaves, satisfied, apparently, that the matter had been properly settled. Elena was looking at Simon. He was looking at her. Neither of them said anything for a moment, because there was nothing that needed to be said immediately, and they had both learned, in their own separate and difficult ways, the particular value of not rushing to fill a silence that was already doing useful work. Then Fern, who was the youngest of the 4 by a matter of minutes and operated on a schedule entirely her own, separate from her sister's collective rhythm, appeared at the bench and announced that she was hungry, and that they had been in the park for a very long time, and could they please go to the place with the good soup. "In a minute," Elena said. "You always say in a minute," Fern said. "Because it's always true," Elena said. She looked at Simon. "There's a place on the corner. They make good soup, if you don't have anywhere else to be." He looked down at his coffee cup, which had been empty for the better part of half an hour. "I don't have anywhere to be." They walked out of the park together, the 4 girls moving ahead in the loose, unhurried formation of children who know exactly where they're going and feel no particular need to wait for the slower adults trailing behind them. Simon and Elena walked at the pace of 2 people in the middle of a conversation who feel no urgency about reaching its end. The leaves came down around them the whole way, in that same unhurried October fashion, no wind, just gravity, just time doing the only thing time knows how to do. And sometimes, if you happen to be sitting on the right bench at the right moment with the right tattoo on your arm, something else happens too, something that 4 small girls in matching green coats and matching mustard beanies had set entirely in motion, simply by stopping, and pointing, and saying the truest thing they knew. Marlowe's, the soup place on the corner, was small and warm and smelled like rosemary and bread, the kind of place that had clearly been serving the same neighborhood long enough to know most of its regulars by name and order. The girls installed themselves at a round table by the window with the practiced efficiency of children who had been here many times before, arguing amiably over who got the seat closest to the wall, which Ivy apparently considered a matter of significant strategic importance. Elena ordered a bowl of tomato soup for herself, 4 smaller bowls for the girls, and looked at Simon expectantly. "Whatever you're having," he said. "I trust the recommendation." "Big mistake," Sage said solemnly from across the table, without looking up from her crayons. "She always says that and then she doesn't share." "I share plenty," Elena said. "You share bites," Sage said. "Not soup." Simon laughed, a real laugh, the kind he hadn't produced without effort in longer than he wanted to admit, and Elena caught his eye across the table with an expression that suggested she'd noticed the specific shape of that laugh too, had clocked it as something slightly rusty coming back into use. They talked through lunch about smaller things now, the girls' school, a substitute teacher who'd apparently let them watch a movie about penguins 3 separate times that month, whether Ivy's newfound interest in chess was a genuine passion or a strategy to get out of soccer practice, which Elena suspected strongly was the latter, and Ivy denied with the particular vehemence of someone who knows they've been caught. Underneath the ordinary conversation, though, there was something else moving, the specific electricity of two people who had just discovered, entirely by accident, that a stranger had been carrying a private grief and a private hope shaped almost identically to their own, for the better part of a decade, without either of them ever knowing the other existed. When the bill came, Simon reached for it before Elena could, and she let him, which surprised her a little, since letting anyone pay for anything had become, over 8 years of managing everything alone, a habit she'd mostly lost the muscle for. "Thank you," she said. "For the soup, and for not making this weirder than it already was." "I don't think it was weird," Simon said. "I think it was the least weird thing that's happened to me in 2 years." "Can we see you again?" Ren asked, with the direct, unfiltered confidence of a 7-year-old who saw no reason to leave the question to the adults. Elena's face went slightly pink. "Ren. What? He's nice. And he has the good bird." Simon looked at Elena, a question in his face that wasn't really about the girls at all. "I'd like that," Elena said. "If you would." "I would," Simon said. "Very much." They exchanged numbers outside Marlowe's, the girls already 3 steps ahead arguing about whether they'd have time to stop at the library before dinner, and Simon spent the rest of that Saturday in a state he didn't have a name for, not quite happiness, not exactly hope, something more like the sensation of a window opening in a room he'd forgotten had windows at all. He texted her that evening, a short message asking whether the girls might like to see a woodworking shop sometime, since Ren had mentioned, in passing at lunch, an interest in building things, and Simon had a workshop full of scrapwood and offcuts that 4 7-year-olds could turn into something without any real risk of losing a finger, provided an adult stayed close. Elena wrote back within the hour. They would lose their entire minds. When? He picked Wednesday, since Elena's clinic schedule left her free that afternoon, and the following Wednesday the 5 of them arrived at his workshop in Ravenswood, a converted garage behind a 2-flat that Simon rented from an elderly landlord who'd stopped charging market rate years ago in exchange for Simon keeping the building's ancient boiler running through the winters. The girls moved through the space with the particular reverence of children encountering a genuinely interesting adult world for the first time, running their hands over the smooth curve of a half-finished chair back, asking what a dozen different tools were called, arguing quietly among themselves about which offcuts of walnut and maple were the prettiest. Simon set them up at a low workbench with sandpaper and small scraps of pine, showing them how to sand with the grain instead of against it, how to feel for the smoothness with their fingertips rather than just their eyes. Elena stood near the bench with a cup of coffee Simon had made her, watching her daughters work with the particular attention of a parent memorizing a moment she suspected, correctly, she'd want to return to later. "You're good with them," she said, when the girls had drifted toward a pile of wood shavings they decided needed further investigation. "They're easy to be good with," Simon said. "They ask real questions. Most adults have stopped doing that." "They ask a lot of questions," Elena said. "Constantly. It's exhausting and also the best thing about them." He showed her the walnut table then, the one in his own dining room across the yard in his apartment, and told her, for the first time in full, about Alec and the ice storm and the 4th coat of oil. She listened without trying to fix anything, the way he'd already come to expect from her by then, and when he finished she simply reached out and touched the surface of the table gently, the way you'd touch something you understood to be sacred without needing it explained further. "He'd like that you finished it," she said. "I think so too," Simon said. "Some days I'm more sure of that than others." "That sounds about right," Elena said. "Grief doesn't usually agree to be consistent." Ren appeared at Simon's elbow holding up a small, slightly lopsided box she'd apparently constructed from scraps and an alarming quantity of wood glue. "I made a box," she announced, with the gravity of someone unveiling a major architectural achievement. "That's an excellent box," Simon said, examining it seriously. "It's for you," Ren said. "So you have somewhere to keep small things." Simon looked at the box for a long moment, then at Ren, then at Elena, who was watching the whole exchange with an expression he couldn't fully read. "Thank you," he said. "I don't have anything small enough to put in it yet. But I will." He kept that box on his workbench from that day forward, and eventually, though this part of the story comes later, it did come to hold something small enough to matter. Over the following weeks, Wednesdays became a fixture, then Saturdays returned to the park, this time with an extra adult trailing the 4 girls through the leaves, and slowly, without either of them ever formally deciding it should happen this way, Simon became a regular feature of Elena's household rather than an occasional, novel visitor to it. He learned the girls' individual rhythms the way you learn the particular grain of a piece of wood, slowly, through repeated contact rather than through any single defining lesson. Ivy needed to win at things, gently and often, or she withdrew into a private sulk that took a full hour to talk her out of. Ren asked the real questions, the ones that cut straight to whatever mattered, and required real answers in return, not the deflections adults sometimes tried on children. Sage noticed everything and said almost none of it out loud until she turned it over privately for a day or two, at which point she'd deliver some devastatingly accurate observation about a person or a situation with the flat, unbothered tone of someone reading a weather report. Fern, the youngest by minutes, ran on her own schedule entirely, arriving late to every meal and every conversation and every emotional reaction, a beat or two behind her sisters, but arriving all the same, thoroughly and completely, once she got there. Elena watched Simon learn all of this with a kind of quiet astonishment she didn't fully trust at first, worried it was too easy, too soon, too neatly arranged after 8 years of largely managing everything alone. She dated occasionally over those 8 years, carefully, cautiously, always keeping the girls at a careful remove until she was certain enough of a relationship's staying power to risk the introduction. Most of those relationships hadn't survived the introduction. Something about 4 identical 7-year-olds with strong personalities and an even stronger sense of collective judgment tended to filter out anyone who wasn't genuinely, fully willing to be there. Simon didn't filter out. If anything, he leaned in, the way he approached everything, she noticed, with the patient, attentive focus he brought to a piece of unfinished wood, understanding what something wanted to become before deciding what to make of it. "You're not scared of them," she said to him one evening in November, the two of them sitting on her back steps while the girls finished a movie inside, visible through the window as 4 small shapes arranged in a row on the couch. "Should I be?" "Most people are, a little. For kids who look identical and think as a unit half the time. It's a lot." "I think they're the best part of you," Simon said. "I'd be an idiot to be scared of the best part of somebody." Elena didn't say anything for a moment, just looked at him in the porch light with an expression that had, by then, become familiar to him, the specific look of someone recalibrating what they'd believed was possible for their own life. "Daniel was scared of them," she said quietly. "Not at first. But by the end. I think that's part of what happened, if I'm honest about it. For is a lot of person to be responsible for loving all at once, and I think he looked at that math one day and got scared of coming up short." "I'm not doing math," Simon said. "I'm just showing up on Wednesdays." "That's the whole math," Elena said. "That's the entire equation. You just solved it without trying." Simon's mother, Diane, met Ivy, Ren, Sage, and Fern for the first time in early December, roughly 2 months after that first October morning, over a dinner Simon had arranged carefully, understanding that this particular introduction carried its own specific weight. Diane had lost one son already, and Simon knew, without either of them needing to discuss it directly, that she approached anything resembling a growing new family with a complicated mixture of hope and old, protective fear. Diane arrived at Elena's house with a homemade pie and an expression Simon recognized immediately as her company face, the careful, pleasant mask she wore around anyone she hadn't yet decided to trust completely. The girls, for their part, approached the introduction with their usual collective curiosity, sizing up this new adult with the particular directness children reserve for people who matter to someone they already love. It was Fern, predictably arriving a beat behind her sister's more measured politeness, who broke the ice within the first 10 minutes, asking Diane bluntly whether she was sad about Alec, a question that made Elena's stomach drop and Simon go momentarily still, uncertain how his mother would receive something so direct from a child she'd only just met. Diane, to Simon's quiet relief, answered without flinching. "Every day," she said simply. "But I'm allowed to be sad about him and happy about all of you at the same time. Both things live in me together. I'm getting better at letting them share the space." Fern considered this with her characteristic seriousness. "That's how Simon says grief works too. Not one thing at a time. Both things together. He learned that the hard way," Diane said. "I'm glad it stuck." Over the course of the dinner, Diane's careful company mask gradually softened, worn down by the particular, disarming honesty of 4 13-year-old girls who had, over the preceding 2 months, apparently absorbed something of Simon's own directness and Elena's own hard-won clarity. Ren asked Diane detailed questions about Alec, what he was like, what he found funny, whether he and Simon had fought as children, questions Diane answered at length, visibly grateful, Simon thought, for the rare opportunity to speak about her lost son plainly, without anyone in the room flinching away from the subject the way adults so often did. You ask good questions, Diane told Ren, toward the end of the meal. Most people are scared to ask about him at all. They think it'll make me sadder, mentioning him. It doesn't work like that. Not mentioning him is what makes me sadder, most days. It's like everyone's decided to pretend he never happened, just to spare my feelings, when actually what spares my feelings is people remembering him with me instead of around me. I'll remember him, Ren said, with the simple, total conviction of a child making an important promise. Even though I never met him. I'll remember the parts you tell me. Diane's eyes filled, and she reached across the table to squeeze Ren's hand, unable, for a moment, to find further words. Later that evening, once the girls had been sent off to finish homework and Elena had retreated briefly to the kitchen, Diane found Simon alone on the porch, the same porch where he and Elena had first talked about Alec months earlier. They're remarkable, Diane said. All four of them. I don't know how you got so lucky, finding a family like this after everything. I don't think it was luck exactly, Simon said. Or maybe it was, but it was a very specific, very patient kind of luck, built out of a lot of small things happening in the right order over a long time. Well, whatever it was, Diane said, I'm grateful for it. I was worried, watching you these past 2 years, that you'd forgotten how to let yourself want something good again. I don't worry about that anymore. I didn't forget, Simon said. I think I just needed somewhere to land first. Turns out the landing took longer than I expected, but it happened exactly when it was supposed to. They spent that first Christmas together as a tentative, still forming unit, 3 months into whatever it was they were building, at Elena's house, with Beatrice presiding over the kitchen and Simon contributing, at the girls' specific and repeated request, a hand-built ornament for each of them, small wooden birds, each one different, each one caught in a slightly different posture, some mid-flight, some settling toward a branch, a quiet echo of the tattoo design that none of the girls fully understood the significance of yet, though Elena caught its meaning immediately, and had to excuse herself briefly to the kitchen to compose herself when she saw them hanging on the tree. Diane joined them for part of the day, still new enough to the family's rhythm to feel slightly like a guest rather than a fixture, though the girls worked hard, in their own unself-conscious way, to make her feel otherwise, insisting she help decorate the last unclaimed section of the tree, involving her directly in an argument over whether the star or the angel belonged on top this year, a debate that had apparently been raging in the household for several Christmases running without final resolution. It was, by any measure, an unusual Christmas, a blended, still tentative family working out its first shared holiday traditions in real time, Daniel's scheduled visit with the girls happening the day before rather than on Christmas itself this particular year, an arrangement everyone had agreed to with more ease than Elena had expected, given how carefully custody logistics usually had to be negotiated between them. Late that evening, once the girls were finally, reluctantly in bed, having spent the better part of an hour negotiating for just 5 more minutes with the new gifts scattered across the living room floor, Simon and Elena sat together by the fire, the small wooden birds catching the firelight from their places on the tree. This is the first Christmas in 8 years I haven't spent entirely braced for something to go wrong, Elena admitted quietly. I don't think I fully noticed how much tension I usually carry into this particular day until I noticed its absence tonight. I noticed something similar, Simon said. This is the first Christmas in 3 years I haven't spent mostly just getting through it. Usually I count down until it's over. Tonight I found myself wishing it would slow down instead. What changed? Elena asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. You did, Simon said simply. All 5 of you. I didn't know I was allowed to want a whole loud, chaotic family Christmas again until I was sitting in the middle of one. Turns out I wanted it more than I'd let myself admit. Elena leaned her head against his shoulder, watching the fire, watching the small wooden birds catch the light one more time before the evening wound down entirely. Next year, she said, we should get a bigger tree. This one barely fit 5 ornaments worth of new tradition. I think we're going to need more room. Next year, Simon agreed, we'll get whatever size tree this family actually needs. I have a feeling it's going to keep growing. It did. Every year after that, without exception, the tree got a little bigger, and the small wooden birds joined eventually by new ones, new traditions, new ornaments the girls made themselves as they grew older never once came down from wherever they'd been hung that very first tentative Christmas, a quiet, permanent fixture in a family that had, by then, stopped feeling tentative about anything at all. Daniel Ferris had remained, over the 8 years since he'd left, a mostly reliable but emotionally distant presence in his daughters' lives, dependable for the scheduled custody weekends, present for birthdays and school concerts, generous with child support in the specific, careful way of a man who decided the financial obligation was the part of fatherhood he could most cleanly fulfill. He'd remarried 3 years earlier, to a woman named Priscilla who worked in commercial real estate and had, as far as Elena could tell, no particular interest in becoming a stepmother to 4 girls who weren't hers, a fact the girls themselves had noticed and processed in their own separate, individual ways over the years. He noticed Simon's presence in his daughter's lives around the same time Simon noticed Wren's small wooden box sitting permanently on his workbench sometime in early December, when Ivy mentioned, during a scheduled Sunday dinner at Daniel's condo, that Simon had helped her build a chess set out of scrapwood, and that Simon thought her interest in chess was probably real, actually, not just an excuse to avoid soccer, a small detail that landed with more weight than Elena had anticipated. When Ivy had reported it to her afterward, Daniel called Elena the following Tuesday evening. "Who's Simon?" he asked, without much preamble. "Someone I've been seeing," Elena said. "For a couple of months now. The girls talk about him constantly. They like him." There was a pause on the line. "I want to meet him," Daniel said. "Before this goes further. I have a right to know who's around my daughters." Elena felt the old, familiar tightening in her chest that conversations with Daniel still occasionally produced, even 8 years and a great deal of therapy later. "You have a right to reasonable involvement in decisions about their welfare," she said carefully. "You don't have veto power over who I date." "I'm not talking about veto power. I'm talking about meeting the man." "That's fair," Elena admitted, after a moment. "I'll arrange it." The dinner, 3 weeks later, at a mutually agreed-upon restaurant neutral enough to feel like diplomatic territory, was tense in the way Elena had expected and Simon had not fully anticipated, having only heard about Daniel in the careful, measured way Elena discussed him honestly, without excessive bitterness, but without much warmth either. Daniel arrived alone, without Priscilla, which Elena took as a small, deliberate signal that this conversation was meant to be about the girls specifically, not a broader social occasion. He was polite to Simon in the particular guarded way of a man conducting an interview rather than having a conversation, asking about Simon's work, his background, his intentions, with a directness that bordered on interrogation. "I want to be straightforward," Daniel said, partway through the meal. "I left when the girls were young. I know what that cost Elena, and I know what it's probably still costing them, in ways I don't always see because I'm not the one there every day. I don't have a lot of moral high ground to stand on here. But I do care what happens to them, even if I don't always show it the way Elena thinks I should." "I appreciate you saying that," Simon said. "I'm not trying to replace anything. I'm not trying to be their father. I just like being around them, and I like being around Elena, and I'm trying to do that honestly, one Wednesday at a time." Daniel studied him for a long moment. "That's roughly what Ivy said about you. Word for word, actually. He just shows up, every Wednesday, and doesn't make a big deal about it." He looked at Elena. "That's more consistency than I managed for a long time. I'm not going to stand in the way of them having that, even if it's a strange thing for me to sit here and say." Elena hadn't expected that particular admission, and she found herself, driving home that night, turning it over with a complicated mixture of gratitude and old grief she hadn't fully expected to resurface. Daniel wasn't a villain in the story of her life, not exactly, whatever the girls privately felt about him at various ages. He was simply a man who had made one enormous, life-altering decision at 28 and had spent the 8 years since living in its long, complicated aftermath alongside the rest of them, in his own separate, more distant way. Not everything about that winter unfolded smoothly. In late January, during a stretch of bitter cold that kept the girls mostly indoors for 2 straight weeks, Sage, the quiet one, the observer, the sister who noticed everything and said almost none of it out loud until she turned it over privately for a day or two, asked Elena a question at bedtime that Elena hadn't fully prepared herself to answer. "Are you going to marry Simon?" Elena sat down slowly on the edge of Sage's bed. That's a big question for a Tuesday night. You don't have to answer if it's private, Sage said, with the careful, considerate tone she used for questions she suspected might be too large for the moment. I just wondered. Because if you are, I want to know now, so I have time to get used to it before it happens. I don't like surprises as much as Ren does. I don't know yet, Elena said honestly. It's still pretty new, sweetheart. But I like him. A lot. More than I've liked anyone in a long time. Does he like you back the same amount? I think so. Yes. Sage considered this with her characteristic seriousness. What if it doesn't work? What if he leaves, like Dad did? Elena felt the question land somewhere deep and old in her chest, a question she'd privately asked herself more than once over the preceding months, usually late at night, usually when the day's warmth had worn off enough to let the old fear back in. I can't promise you it won't ever be hard, or that people never leave, Elena said slowly, choosing her words with care. That would be a lie, and I don't lie to you girls about the big things. But I can tell you that Simon shows up. Every single time he says he will. He's never once cancelled a Wednesday, not for weather, not for a big project at the workshop, not for anything. That doesn't guarantee the future. But it tells me something true about who he is right now, and right now is the only place any of us actually get to live in. Sage nodded slowly, absorbing this the way she absorbed most things, quietly, thoroughly, without an immediate visible reaction. Okay, she said eventually. I like him too. I just wanted to say the scary part out loud once, so it wasn't just living in my head by itself. That's a very smart thing to do, Elena said, smoothing Sage's hair back from her forehead. I'm proud of you for asking. She told Simon about the conversation a few days later, sitting across from him at his kitchen table while the girls did homework in the next room. She's not wrong to be scared, Simon said, after Elena finished. I'd be worried if she wasn't. It means she's paying attention to what actually happened to her family once already. I don't want them scared, though. Not of you. I don't think she's scared of me, Simon said. I think she's scared of the general shape of what could happen. That's a different thing, and I don't think there's a version of this where I convince her out of that fear with words. I think the only thing that convinces a 7-year-old who's already been burned once is time. Showing up, over and over, until the evidence outweighs the fear. That's a long project, Elena said. I'm a carpenter, Simon said. I like long projects. I like the ones where you don't get to see the finished shape for a while, and you just have to trust the process is sound. Elena's mother, Beatrice, had been a steady, if occasionally overbearing, presence throughout the 8 years since Daniel left, the one who'd taken rotating shifts of quadruplet care during Elena's final semester of graduate school, the one who still, 8 years later, showed up unannounced with groceries whenever she sensed, through whatever maternal instrument mothers seemed to possess, that Elena's week had gotten away from her. Beatrice had strong opinions about most things, and an even stronger habit of sharing them without being asked, a trait Elena had spent much of her adult life alternately resenting and, more recently, coming to appreciate as a specific and durable form of love. She'd been skeptical, at first, of the whole situation with Simon, not because she disliked him on principle, but because she'd watched her daughter get her heart broken once already in a way that had cost 8 years to fully recover from, and she wasn't inclined to trust a new development easily. A tattoo coincidence, Beatrice said, the first time Elena told her the story, her tone carrying the particular skepticism of a woman who had lived long enough to distrust anything that sounded too much like a movie. That's how you met him. In a park. Because of a tattoo. That's how it started, Elena said. It's not why I'm still seeing him 3 months later. What's the why, then? Elena thought about it seriously before answering, the way she'd learned to answer Beatrice's real questions rather than deflecting them. He shows up. Every single time, without fail. He doesn't do the thing men sometimes do where they're wonderful for the first 2 months and then the effort quietly stops once they've got you. He's been just as present in month 3 as he was in week 1. That's not a coincidence, Mom. That's a choice he keeps making, over and over. Beatrice invited Simon to Sunday dinner in February, a formal, if slightly awkward, occasion that Elena had braced for with the particular dread of watching two important people in her life size each other up across a pot roast. Simon arrived with a small, hand-built cutting board he'd made specifically for the occasion, walnut with a maple inlay, the kind of gift that required real thought and real time, not something purchased in a hurry the night before. Beatrice examined it for a long moment before setting it down. "You made this?" "Last week. I wanted to bring something that wasn't just wine." "Most men bring wine," Beatrice said. "I figured you'd had enough wine from men who didn't stick around," Simon said. "I wanted to bring something that would still be useful in 10 years. Beatrice looked at him for a long moment, something shifting behind her eyes that Elena recognized, having seen it exactly twice before in her life, once when Beatrice had finally, grudgingly approved of Elena's choice of graduate school, and once, many years earlier, at Elena's wedding to Daniel, a memory that suddenly felt strange and distant to be recalling in this particular context. "Well," Beatrice said finally. "Sit down, then. Dinner's getting cold." Later that evening, after Simon had left and the girls were in bed, Beatrice found Elena in the kitchen doing dishes and stood beside her for a moment without speaking, drawing a plate with more attention than the task strictly required. "I like him," she said eventually. "You barely said 3 words to him all night." "I didn't need 300 words. I watched him with the girls at dinner. He listened to Fern's entire 7-minute story about a hamster at school with actual attention, not the polite performance most adults do. That tells me everything I need to know about a man." She set the plate down carefully. "Your father was like that. Genuinely interested in small things other people found boring. It's rarer than people think." "Do you think it'll last?" Elena asked, surprising herself with the directness of the question. Beatrice considered it honestly. "I think the ones who show up in the boring, unglamorous moments are usually the ones who show up in the hard ones too. Daniel was wonderful at the exciting parts and terrible at the boring ones. This one seems to be built the other way around. I'd put my money on the second kind if I were placing bets, which, for the record, I generally don't, except tonight, apparently, I am. It wasn't all easy, and it would be dishonest to tell this story as though it was." In March, 5 months into whatever it was they were building together, Simon and Elena had their first real argument, the kind that isn't about the surface subject at all but about something much older sitting underneath it. It started small. Elena had made plans, without fully consulting Simon first, for the girls to spend a Saturday with Daniel and Priscilla at a children's museum downtown, a plan that happened to fall on the same Saturday Simon had, weeks earlier, mentioned wanting to take the girls to visit a lumber mill outside the city, something Wren in particular had been looking forward to for a month. "You didn't even ask me," Simon said, when Elena mentioned the conflict almost in passing over the phone. "You just told me it's happening." "I didn't think I needed to ask you," Elena said, surprised by the sharpness in his voice. "Daniel is their father. His schedule with them isn't something I run past you first." "That's not what I meant. I meant the lumber mill. We talked about it for a month. Wren's been excited about it for a month. And you just moved it without saying anything, like it wasn't a real plan." "It wasn't a real plan, Simon. It was a maybe, someday, when things line up. Daniel asking for a specific Saturday with his daughters is a real plan, with real custody logistics behind it." The conversation escalated in the particular, exhausting way arguments do when both people are technically right about something and neither one feels heard about the thing underneath the technicality. Simon, Elena realized only later, hadn't really been upset about the lumber mill at all. He'd been upset about a much older fear resurfacing, the fear, unexamined until that moment, that he occupied a fundamentally more provisional place in the girls' lives than Daniel did, biologically and legally, no matter how many Wednesdays he showed up for. That whatever he was building with them could be rearranged at will by people with more official standing than he had, and there was nothing he could do about it except accept the rearrangement gracefully and hope it didn't happen too often. Elena, for her part, hadn't fully processed her own reaction until she was lying awake that night turning the argument over. She'd bristled, she realized, because some old, defensive part of her, the part built during the hardest years after Daniel left, still operated from the assumption that she alone bore final responsibility for every decision about the girls, that consulting anyone else, even someone she trusted as much as she'd come to trust Simon, felt like a kind of vulnerability she hadn't fully practiced in 8 years of managing everything alone. They didn't resolve it that night. Simon left frustrated, Elena stayed frustrated, and for 3 days they exchanged shorter, more careful texts than usual, the kind that circle a subject without landing on it. It was Ren, in the end, who forced the issue, in the direct, unfiltered way only a 7-year-old manages. She called Simon herself, using Elena's phone without asking, on the third evening. "Are you mad at Mom?" she asked, when he picked up, clearly startled to see Elena's number and hear a small voice instead. "I'm not mad," Simon said carefully. "We're just figuring something out." "Is it about the lumber mill?" "Sort of. It's more complicated than that." "You can still come," Ren said. "Even if it's not this Saturday. We can go another Saturday. I don't mind waiting if you're still going to come eventually." Simon sat with that for a moment, feeling something in his chest loosen that had been tight for 3 days. "I'm still going to come eventually," he said. "I promise." "Okay," Ren said, satisfied, and hung up without further ceremony, the way children do once they've resolved the part of the problem that was actually theirs to resolve. Elena called him 20 minutes later. "She called you." "She did." "I'm sorry," Elena said. "I think I reacted to something that wasn't really about the lumber mill either. I think I'm still not fully used to having someone else's feelings to weigh into a decision. 8 years of just deciding things myself is a hard habit to break, even when I want to break it." "I think I reacted to something bigger than the lumber mill too," Simon admitted. "I think I got scared, for a minute, that I'm always going to be the plan that gets moved when a more official plan comes along. That's not fair to put on you. It's an old fear I brought into this, not something you actually did." "You're not the plan that gets moved," Elena said quietly. "I should have asked you before I confirmed with Daniel. That was a mistake on my part, not a reflection of where you stand." They rescheduled the lumber mill trip for the following Saturday. Daniel's museum day went forward as planned. Nobody's world ended. And Simon found, in the aftermath, that the argument had actually clarified something rather than damaged it, a working knowledge, hard one, that they could disagree, misstep, and still find their way back to each other without either of them disappearing the way people had disappeared on both of them before. The rescheduled trip to the lumber mill, on a bright, cold Saturday in early April, turned into one of the days Simon would return to most often in his memory of that year, long after the details of the argument that nearly displaced it had faded into something small and unimportant. The mill sat 40 minutes outside the city, a sprawling, fragrant operation that processed rough timber into the kind of dimensional lumber and specialty boards Simon bought in smaller quantities for his own workshop. The owner, a weathered man named Hollis who'd known Simon for a decade through regular business, gave the 5 of them a private tour, showing the girls how a raw log became a finished board, how the growth rings told the story of a tree's whole life if you knew how to read them. Ren asked Hollis approximately 40 questions over the course of the tour, ranging from reasonable, "How do you know which way to cut it?" to considerably less so, "Do trees feel it when you cut them, and if they do, is that sad for you every day, and how do you sleep at night?" the last of which prompted a long, thoughtful pause from Hollis before he crouched down to her level and gave her an answer serious enough to satisfy her, something about how a good woodworker's whole job was making. Sure, a tree's life continued meaning something even after it had been cut, in the shape of tables and chairs and things families would use and love for decades. Ren considered this at length. "So it's not sad. It's just different." "That's about the size of it," Hollis said. Sage, characteristically quieter throughout the tour, pulled Simon aside near the end of it, while Elena and the other 3 examined a pile of offcuts Hollis had said they could take home. "I wanted to say I'm sorry," Sage said. "About being scared, before. About whether you'd stay." "You don't need to apologize for that," Simon said. "It was a smart thing to ask about." "I'm less scared now," Sage said. "I wanted you to know that. In case it helps." Simon knelt down to her height, the way he'd learned to over the preceding months, understanding that Sage's real conversations happened at a level closer to the ground, quieter, more private than her sister's. "It helps a lot, actually," he said. "Thank you for telling me." They drove home that evening with the truck bed full of walnut and cherry offcuts, 4 exhausted girls asleep or nearly asleep in the back seat, Elena beside him in the passenger seat watching the winter fields give way slowly to the edges of the city. "Thank you for not giving up on the lumber mill," she said quietly, so as not to wake the girls. "After everything that week." "I wasn't ever going to give up on it," Simon said. "I don't really know how to give up on things I've decided to care about. It's not really in my toolkit." "That's a good toolkit to have," Elena said, reaching over and resting her hand on his on the gearshift. "It's the only one I've got," he said. "I figure it's served me all right so far." In May, 7 months after that first October morning, Simon took Elena to visit his brother's grave for the first time, a quiet cemetery on the northwest side of the city, where a small stone marked Alec Ashford's name and the 8 years he'd managed to live before the ice storm took the rest of them from him. Simon had never brought anyone here before, not in 2 years, not even his mother, who visited on her own schedule and had never asked Simon to accompany her, understanding, in the particular way mothers sometimes understand their children's grief, that Simon needed to grieve on his own private terms, in his own private places. "I don't really know why I wanted you to see this," Simon admitted, standing at the edge of the plot with his hands in his pockets. "I don't have a plan for what happens once we're here. I just didn't want it to be a thing I kept separate from you anymore." "You don't need a plan," Elena said. "I'm just here." They stood together in front of the stone for a long while, saying nothing, the particular kind of silence Simon had come, over the preceding months, to recognize as the good kind, the kind that did useful work all on its own without needing to be filled. "He would have liked you," Simon said eventually. "He liked people who asked real questions and didn't perform politeness for its own sake. You do that. You did it the very first day, in the park, when you just asked where I got the tattoo instead of pretending you hadn't noticed." "I couldn't have pretended if I'd tried," Elena said. "It knocked the wind out of me a little, honestly. Seeing it on someone else's arm." "He'd have liked the girls too," Simon said. "He always wanted to be an uncle to somebody. He used to say that, actually, more than once, before he'd even met anyone serious. That he wanted to be the uncle who taught the kids something useless and wonderful, like how to whistle with a blade of grass, or how to skip a stone properly." He paused. "I taught Ren how to skip a stone last week, actually, down at the river. I didn't plan it. It just came out of me, the exact way he used to teach me." Elena reached for his hand. "Then he's getting to be that uncle, in a way. Just through you instead." Simon didn't say anything for a long moment, looking at the stone, at the dates carved into it, at the particular finality of granite that never changes no matter how much time passes around it. "I used to come here and just feel the loss," he said eventually. "Just the size of it, over and over, every time. Today's the first time I've come here and felt like I was bringing him something instead of just carrying something away." They sat together afterward on a bench near the cemetery's entrance, a plain wooden bench that reminded Simon, he mentioned to Elena, a little of the one in Horner Park where all of this had started. "Maybe benches are just where the important things happen to us," Elena said. "Maybe," Simon said. "Or maybe we just need somewhere to sit still long enough for the important things to catch up to us. Either way, I'm glad I keep finding the right one." The quadruplet's 8th birthday fell in late June, and Elena, for the first time in 8 years, found herself planning the party with real, uncomplicated help rather than managing every detail alone while fielding Daniel's periodic, well-meaning but logistically useless offers to "let me know if you need anything." Simon built 4 small, identical stools for the occasion, matching in every respect except for a single letter carved discreetly into the underside of each seat, I, W, S, and F, so that each girl would eventually be able to identify which one was truly hers. A detail he'd worked out carefully after weeks of quiet deliberation about how to give 4 identical children something that felt equally personal to each of them without any hint of favoritism. "You didn't have to do that," Elena said, when he unveiled them the morning of the party, 4 small stools lined up on her back porch. "I wanted to," Simon said. "I've been thinking about it for a month. It's hard, giving 4 kids the same gift and having it feel individual. I think I finally figured out how." The party itself was loud and chaotic in the specific way of 8-year-old birthday parties, populated by a dozen classmates, Beatrice presiding over the cake table with quiet, watchful pride, Priya and her own 3 children arriving with a gift bag and the easy comfort of 8 years of neighborly friendship, Daniel and Priscilla appearing for an hour in the early afternoon, polite and contained, leaving before the chaos peaked, which Elena had come, over the years, to understand as simply the shape of Daniel's particular, limited but genuine effort. Simon spent most of the party doing what he'd quietly become expert at doing, noticing the small things nobody else noticed. He caught Sage slipping away from the noise at one point and found her sitting alone on the back steps, and rather than steering her back into the party, simply sat down beside her in comfortable silence until she was ready to rejoin on her own terms. He made sure Fern, who ran perpetually a beat behind her sisters, wasn't left scrambling to catch the last piece of cake or the good party favor once the faster girls had already claimed the best of everything. Late in the afternoon, once most of the guests had gone and only the closest circle remained on the back porch in the softening summer light, Wren climbed up onto Simon's lap uninvited, the way she'd started doing over the preceding months, a small, casual gesture of trust that had taken root slowly and then, all at once, become simply how things were. "Are you going to be here for my 9th birthday too?" she asked. Simon glanced at Elena, who was watching the exchange with an expression caught somewhere between amusement and something deeper, more tender. "I'm planning on it," Simon said. "If that's all right with everybody." "It's all right with me," Wren said, with the simple, unadorned authority of an 8-year-old who considered the matter now officially settled. "I already told Sage you would be." "I was right." "You were right," Simon agreed. Beatrice, standing nearby with a slice of cake she hadn't yet touched, caught Elena's eye across the porch and gave her the smallest, knowing nod, the kind mothers give daughters when they've watched enough of life unfold to recognize, quietly, the exact moment something has become permanent, well before anyone said the actual words out loud. By late summer, Simon had started thinking, in the quiet, deliberate way he thought about everything important, about what came next. He didn't rush the thought, the way he'd learned not to rush a piece of wood before it was ready to tell him what it wanted to become, but the thought itself had become a steady, patient presence in the back of his mind, growing clearer with each passing month. He tracked down Theo Lindqvist that August, 3 months into his retirement, living in a small bungalow in Logan Square where he'd apparently taken up woodworking himself, an irony Simon appreciated the moment Theo mentioned it, laughing at the strange symmetry of a retired tattoo artist and a carpenter comparing notes on their respective crafts of shaping something permanent out of raw material. "I need a favor," Simon said, once they'd caught up over coffee at Theo's kitchen table. "Not a tattoo. Something else." He explained what he had in mind, a ring, but not an ordinary one, something that carried the same 3 elements as the tattoo, shrunk down and reimagined in metal rather than ink. A tiny compass, its needle no longer broken but pointing true. A stem, this time with the smallest possible flower finally blooming at its tip. A bird, no longer suspended between arriving and leaving, but settled, at rest, home. Theo listened to all of it with the same long, careful attention he'd once given 2 separate sketches years apart, both of them describing, without either stranger knowing it, the exact same private ache. "You want me to design this," Theo said. "Not ink it. Actually design the piece itself." "I know it's not really what you do anymore," Simon said. "But I can't think of anyone else who'd understand what it needs to mean without me having to explain the whole thing from scratch." Theo was quiet for a long moment, turning his coffee mug slowly between his hands. "You know," he said eventually, "in 30 years of doing this work, I put a lot of ink on a lot of arms. Compasses. Birds. Broken things people wanted to remember being broken, so they'd notice, later, how much they'd healed. I don't remember most of them specifically anymore. But I remember both of yours. I remember thinking, both times, that whoever eventually found the other person wearing the matching ache was going to be very lucky, and I remember thinking, both times, that it probably wouldn't happen, because the world usually isn't built for that kind of symmetry." "It happened anyway," Simon said. "It happened anyway," Theo agreed, something moving behind his eyes that looked, to Simon, almost like tears, though neither of them acknowledged it directly. "I'd be honored to make the ring. Truly. Give me a few weeks." Theo delivered the finished piece in early September, a slim gold band with the 3 tiny figures worked into it with a jeweler's precision far beyond anything Simon could have managed himself, the compass needle true, the stem in bloom, the bird settled and at rest, wings folded, home. "It's perfect," Simon said, turning it over in his palm. "It should be," Theo said. "I had 11 years of practice imagining what the ending of that particular story might look like.
Turns out I imagined it about right.
Simon decided, in the particular deliberate way he decided most important things, that he wasn't going to propose to Elena without first asking her daughters, not for permission exactly, since he understood the actual decision belonged to Elena alone, but for something adjacent to permission, a kind of blessing, an acknowledgement that whatever happened next would reshape their family too, and that their voices deserved to be part of that reshaping before it became official. He arranged, with Beatrice's help and Elena's unknowing cooperation, an afternoon at his workshop while Elena was occupied at a continuing education seminar for work, ostensibly to help the girls finish a project they'd been building together over several Wednesdays, a set of small birdhouses, one for each of them, that had become a running project throughout the late summer. Once the birdhouses were finished, sanded smooth and awaiting only a coat of paint each girl had chosen individually, Simon sat the four of them down on the low workbench where it had all started nearly a year earlier.
I want to ask you all something important, he said. And I want real answers, not the answer you think I want to hear. Can you do that for me?
Ivy, who needed to win at things but who Simon had also learned, over the year, took matters of genuine seriousness with surprising gravity once she understood the stakes, nodded solemnly.
We can do that. I want to ask your mom to marry me, Simon said.
Before I do that, I wanted to ask you four first, because it changes things for you as much as it changes things for her, maybe more.
I want to know how you'd feel about that. All of you. Honestly.
There was a brief silence, the girls exchanging the particular wordless glance they sometimes shared, a form of communication Simon had never fully learned to read despite a year of trying.
Would you still be Simon, or would we have to call you something else?
Fern asked, arriving, as always, a beat behind the others but landing directly on a question that apparently mattered a great deal to her.
I'd still be Simon, he said. Whatever you're comfortable calling me. That's entirely up to you, now and later. Would you live with us all the time then? Sage asked. Eventually, yes.
If your mom says yes, and if that's something all of you are comfortable with too, in your own time.
Would you still come to the workshop on Wednesdays?
Wren asked, with an urgency that suggested this, of all the questions, mattered most to her.
Every single Wednesday, Simon said. That's not changing, whatever else does.
Ivy had been quiet through the other questions, considering something privately before she finally spoke.
I want to say something and I want you to actually listen, not just be nice about it. I'm listening, Simon said.
Our dad left, Ivy said, her voice steady but careful.
He didn't die like your brother. He just decided to go. I know that's different from what happened to you, but I think about it a lot, that people who are supposed to stay sometimes just don't. I don't want to be scared of that with you. But I think I still am, a little. Even though you've been really good this whole year.
Simon knelt down to her height, the way he'd learned to do for Sage's real conversations, understanding this was one of those moments for Ivy too, whatever her usual bravado suggested about her.
I can't promise you nothing bad will ever happen, he said carefully.
Nobody honest can promise that to anybody, kids or grown-ups.
But I can promise you I'm not the kind of person who leaves because staying got hard. I've had the hardest thing that's ever happened to me happen already, and I didn't leave my own life because of it. I stayed, and I built a table, and eventually I found my way to a park bench, and then to all four of you. I'm not going anywhere just because things get complicated sometimes. That's not who I am, and a year of showing up is the only proof I've got to offer you. I know it might not feel like enough yet. I'm hoping it will, eventually.
Ivy studied him for a long moment, then nodded slowly.
Okay, she said. I believe you.
I still get to be a little scared sometimes, though.
You get to be as scared as you need to be, Simon said. For as long as you need to be. I'm not going anywhere while you work through it.
All four girls, in their own separate ways, gave him what he'd come looking for that afternoon, not a formal permission, nothing so tidy as that, but something more valuable, a collective, hard-won willingness to trust him with the next chapter of their family's story, offered honestly, with their fears included rather than hidden.
So are you going to ask her? Wren said finally, practical as ever. I am, Simon said. Soon. I wanted to talk to you four first. Good, Wren said. Now can we paint the birdhouses? Mine's going to be red.
Simon proposed on the first Saturday of October, almost exactly a year to the week since the four girls in matching green coats had stopped in front of his bench and changed the shape of his life without any of them understanding, in the moment, what they were doing. He arranged it carefully, though carefully for Simon meant something quieter and less theatrical than it might have meant for someone else. No elaborate public display, no orchestrated flash mob, nothing that would have embarrassed Elena or made the moment about anything other than the two of them. Just a walk through Horner Park on an October morning that matched the one a year earlier almost exactly, the same unhurried fall of leaves, the same absence of wind, the same particular quality of light through bare branches that had, apparently, been quietly rearranging his whole life for a year without his full awareness of it happening. They walked the same path Elena had walked with the girls the year before, and Simon steered them, without explaining why, toward the same bench where it had all started. Desmond, the coffee cart vendor, had been quietly recruited weeks earlier and had a fresh cup waiting, exactly as he always did, though this time he caught Simon's eye with a small, knowing nod before retreating tactfully out of earshot.
"This is the bench," Elena said, recognizing it as they approached.
"This is the bench," Simon agreed. He didn't kneel immediately. He sat down first, the way he had a year earlier, and let a comfortable silence settle between them for a moment, the good kind, the kind that did useful work without needing to be filled. "A year ago," he said eventually, "I was sitting right here, not thinking about anything, the way I usually wasn't thinking about anything on Saturday mornings back then, because thinking about things had started to feel like too much work. And then four girls in green coats stopped in front of me, and one of them pointed at my arm, and I haven't stopped thinking about anything since."
In the best possible way.
Elena's eyes had already started to fill, though she hadn't yet fully understood where the conversation was headed, or perhaps she had and simply wanted to let him say it in his own time. "I designed that tattoo 11 years ago," Simon continued, "out of a broken compass, and a stem with no flower, and a bird stuck between arriving and leaving. I designed it because I didn't know where I was going, and I didn't know if the good thing I was hoping for would ever actually happen, and I felt suspended between two places that neither one felt like home." He reached into his jacket pocket.
"I had a friend redesign it recently. Smaller. Different. I want to show you what it looks like now."
He opened his hand to reveal the ring Theo had made, the compass needle true, the stem in bloom, the bird settled at rest, wings folded, home.
"I'm not suspended anymore," Simon said.
"I know exactly where I'm going, and it's toward you, and toward ivy and wren and sage and fern, for as long as all of you will have me. I've spent a year proving that on Wednesdays, one at a time, because I know words are cheap and consistency is the only currency that actually means anything. But I wanted to ask, formally, properly, whether you'd let me keep proving it, for the rest of both our lives."
"Elena, will you marry me?"
She was crying by the time he finished, the good kind of crying, and it took her a moment to find her voice enough to answer, though the answer, when it came, was immediate and entirely unhesitant.
"Yes," she said.
"Obviously yes. I think I decided yes about 11 months ago, and I've just been waiting for you to catch up to the question." He slid the ring onto her finger, and for a long moment neither of them said anything else, sitting together on the same bench where a year earlier four small girls in matching green coats had set an entire second chance in motion, simply by stopping, and pointing, and saying the truest thing they knew. Somewhere nearby, though neither of them noticed it in the moment, Desmond had quietly signaled a text message he'd promised to send the instant he saw the ring appear, a message that reached, within minutes, both Priya and Dr. Alvarez, two women who would never fully understand, until they heard the whole story much later, exactly how large a role their own small, unremarkable kindnesses had played in bringing this particular bench, this particular morning, this particular ring, into being at all. They told the girls that evening, gathering all four of them at Elena's kitchen table with an announcement Elena had insisted on making together rather than letting Simon carry it alone, understanding, correctly, that this needed to be a family moment from the very start rather than news delivered to children after the fact. "We wanted to tell you something," Elena said, once dinner was cleared away and the girls had settled, sensing correctly from the particular energy in the room that something significant was about to happen.
"Simon asked me to marry him today."
I said yes. There was a beat of silence, the girls processing this the way they processed most significant news, each in her own separate rhythm. Wren reacted first, predictably, launching out of her chair with a whoop that startled the cat.
"I knew it.
I told Sage in September you were going to do it before Christmas." You did not know the exact timing, Sage said, though without much real argument in her voice, her own face already breaking into a wide, uncharacteristic grin. Ivy sat quietly for a moment longer than her sisters, and Simon watched her carefully, remembering the conversation in the workshop weeks earlier, the fear she'd named honestly and hadn't fully resolved. Are you scared? Simon asked her directly, choosing to address it rather than let it sit unspoken in the room. Ivy considered the question seriously. A little, she admitted. But less than I thought I'd be. I think I've had a year to practice believing you, and it worked better than I expected. That's all I was hoping for, Simon said. A little practice, and a little belief. I'll take it. Fern, arriving as always a beat behind her sister's immediate reactions, finally spoke up with a question that made the whole table laugh. Does this mean we get to wear fancy dresses? Because I've been wanting an excuse for a fancy dress for a really long time. You get to wear fancy dresses, Elena confirmed, laughing. All four of you. Whatever you want, within reason. I want a red one, Ren said immediately. To match my birdhouse. We'll figure out the colors together, Elena said. But yes. Fancy dresses. This is officially happening. Later that night, once the girls were finally settled and the excitement had burned down into the particular satisfied exhaustion of a household that had absorbed genuinely good news, Simon and Elena sat together on the back porch, the ring catching the porch light every time she moved her hand. They took it well, Simon said. They took it better than well, Elena said. I think, somewhere in this past year, they stopped seeing you as a guest in our lives and started seeing you as a fixture. I don't think tonight was really the surprise. I think tonight was just the formal confirmation of something they'd already quietly decided was true a while ago. When do you think that happened? Simon asked. The quiet decision part. Elena thought about it. Honestly? I think it was the lumber mill. Or maybe the birdhouses. Somewhere in there, it stopped being a question of whether you'd stay and became simply a fact of how our week was shaped. Wednesdays. Saturdays. You, in the workshop, teaching Ren how to skip a stone. I think somewhere in the accumulation of all those ordinary moments, they just quietly decided you belonged, without any of us marking the exact date it happened. That sounds about right to me too, Simon said. I don't think I decided to love you on a single day either. I think I just noticed, one Wednesday, that I already had, and had probably already had for a while before I caught up to noticing it. They planned a small wedding, deliberately, both of them having lived through enough of life's larger complications by then to know exactly what actually mattered and what was simply noise dressed up as tradition. It would happen the following June, they decided, in Beatrice's backyard, which had ample room for the modest guest list they had in mind and held, for Elena at least, 8 years of memory as the place where so much of the hardest early rebuilding had happened, a fact that made it feel right rather than merely convenient. The girls were, unsurprisingly, deeply invested in the planning process, holding strong and occasionally conflicting opinions about nearly every detail. Ren wanted a color scheme built entirely around red, a preference she defended with the same intensity she brought to most of her convictions. Sage quietly assembled a Pinterest board of table settings she shared with Elena without much comment, letting the images speak for her preferences the way she generally let images and observations speak where words felt like too much effort. Ivy negotiated, successfully, for the right to help choose the cake flavor, a responsibility she treated with the gravity of a diplomatic appointment. Fern mostly wanted to know, repeatedly, whether there would be a dance floor, and upon being assured there would, spent several subsequent weeks practicing what she described as wedding dancing in the living room with a seriousness that suggested Olympic-level preparation. Theo Lindqvist, upon hearing the full story of how his two separate tattoo sessions, years apart, had quietly connected two strangers who eventually found their way to each other, insisted on attending, despite having met neither Simon nor Elena more than a handful of times each over the preceding decade. I feel like I have a stake in this, he told Simon, when Simon called to invite him. I put both those tattoos on. I said the exact same sentence to both of you, years apart, without either of you knowing the other existed. I'd like to see how the story actually ends, if you'll let an old tattoo artist crash the party. You're not crashing anything, Simon said. You're the reason there's a party to crash. Of course you're invited. Billionaire, upon learning the full extent of what her 6 months of Thursday casseroles had ultimately set in motion, cried on the phone with Elena for a solid 5 minutes, insisting repeatedly that she hadn't done anything special, that she'd simply done what any decent neighbor would do, a claim Elena firmly and repeatedly rejected. Most neighbors don't show up every single Thursday for 6 months without ever once being asked, Elena told her. You kept me alive that year, Priya. Actually alive, not just metaphorically. I don't think I would have made it to the following spring in one piece without you. You're not just invited to this wedding. You're sitting at the family table. Dr. Alvarez, contacted through the pediatric clinic's front desk with an invitation that included a brief explanation of exactly why she was being invited, wrote back a short note that Elena kept afterward, tucked into a drawer alongside other things she'd decided were worth keeping permanently. I say a lot of things to a lot of exhausted parents and a lot of rushed appointments, the note read. I never know which ones land anywhere important. Thank you for telling me this one did. I'll absolutely be there. Desmond, the coffee cart vendor, needed no explanation at all, having watched the whole thing unfold in real time from his cart near the park entrance over the preceding year, adding extra shots and delivering coffee to a bench that had, without his ever fully realizing it, become the site of an entire family's reinvention. I get to bring the coffee, right? He asked, when Simon extended the invitation. For old time's sake. Extra shot, no charge. You get to bring whatever you want, Simon said. You basically kept me alive on that bench long enough for the whole thing to happen. Least I can do is let you pour the coffee at my wedding. The wedding took place on a warm, clear Saturday in June, in Beatrice's backyard, exactly as planned, under a small arbor Simon had built himself over the preceding months out of reclaimed cedar, the same patient, deliberate craftsmanship he brought to everything he made, understanding what the wood wanted to become before deciding what to make of it. The girls, all 4 of them in dresses they'd chosen together after weeks of negotiation, a soft sage green that Sage had quietly advocated for and eventually won consensus on, since it turned out to suit all 4 of them equally well despite Ren's initial and vocal preference for red, walked ahead of Elena down the short aisle between rows of folding chairs, scattering flower petals with varying degrees of ceremonial seriousness, Fern arriving, as always, a beat behind her sisters in the choreography but landing every step with complete, unhurried confidence once she got there. Beatrice sat in the front row with an expression Elena would remember for years afterward, somewhere between pride and relief and a grief of her own that Elena understood without either of them needing to name it directly, the grief of having watched her daughter survive something devastating, and the corresponding, hard-won joy of watching her arrive, finally, at something that looked like it might actually last. Priya sat 2 rows back, dabbing at her eyes before the ceremony had even properly begun. Dr. Alvarez arrived a few minutes late, straight from a Saturday shift at the clinic, still faintly smelling of hand sanitizer, and slipped into a seat near the back with an expression of genuine wonder at finding herself included in a moment this significant, built from a single offhand sentence she'd delivered years earlier without any memory of having said it at all. Desmond had set up a small coffee station near the reception tables, insisting it was the least he could do, and had already started serving guests before the ceremony even concluded. Theo sat quietly near the aisle, watching the whole thing with the particular satisfaction of a craftsman observing a piece he'd helped shape finally reach its finished form, 11 years and 2 separate sittings after he'd first put needle to skin and said the same 6 words to 2 strangers who would eventually find their way to each other without his ever knowing he'd been part of the mechanism. Simon stood at the arbor in a suit that fit him better than any suit he'd owned before, his mother beside him, quietly crying in the particular way mothers cry at their surviving children's weddings, carrying both joy and the specific weight of a grief that never fully leaves a family, the empty space where Alec should have been standing as best man, a role Simon had instead left symbolically vacant, a single empty chair in the front row bearing a small card that read simply, for Alec, who taught me to skip a stone, and who would have loved every single one of these girls without reservation. When Elena reached the arbor, Simon found he didn't have anything prepared to say beyond what he'd already told her a year earlier, over and over, in 100 ordinary Wednesdays that had turned out to mean more than any single dramatic gesture could have. I don't have new words, he admitted, when it came time for vows, drawing a soft laugh from the gathered guests. I've been saying the same thing to you for a year now, in 100 different ordinary ways. I show up. That's the whole vow, really. I show up on Wednesdays, and I'll show up on the hard days, and I'll show up long after the excitement of a new relationship wears into something quieter and more durable, because that's the only kind of love I actually trust, the kind that survives the boring parts. I promise you all of that, formally, today, though I've already been promising it every week for a year. Elena's vows, when her turn came, circled back to the bench, to the tattoo, to the particular strangeness of two broken people carrying matching designs for years without ever knowing the other existed. I used to think the tattoo was the saddest happy thing I owned, she said, her voice steady despite the tears threatening at its edges. A permanent reminder of the worst year of my life, worn on purpose so I'd never forget how far I'd had to climb back from.
I don't think that anymore.
I think it was always just the first half of a sentence, and I didn't know the second half existed until a stranger sat down on a bench and turned out to be carrying it too. Simon, you're the second half of the sentence.
I'm not scared of the tattoo's meaning anymore. I think it just means us, now. All of it.
The broken compass, the flower, the bird finally landing. I choose you, today and every ordinary Wednesday after this one. The reception spilled across Beatrice's backyard through the golden hour of a June evening, string lights strung between the trees by Simon and a handful of his friends from the workshop world the week before, long tables set with mismatched, borrowed china that Elena had insisted on rather than anything rented and impersonal, because she wanted the whole day to feel like it belonged to the actual people who'd built it rather than to a catalog. Desmond's coffee cart did brisk business well past the point anyone strictly needed caffeine, guests returning again and again less for the coffee itself than for the small, warm ritual of it, and for the story Desmond told anyone who asked, with evident relish, about the extra shot he'd started adding to Simon's order 2 years earlier without ever explaining why, and how that quiet decision had apparently kept a grieving man on a park bench just long enough to be found by the family he hadn't
known he was still waiting for.
Priya found herself seated next to Beatrice for most of the meal, the two women who had each, in their own separate ways, kept Elena upright through her hardest years, comparing notes on the specific difficulty of those early months with the particular camaraderie of people who'd both stood at the edges of the same crisis and quietly done what they could. I used to worry I wasn't doing enough, Priya admitted at one point.
Just a container of food once a week. It felt so small against everything she was carrying.
Small things done consistently are the only things that actually work, Beatrice said.
I've lived a long time.
I've learned that the grand gestures rarely matter as much as people think they do.
It's the Thursdays. The showing up.
That's the whole of it, really. Dr. Alvarez, seated near the dance floor with a glass of wine she'd earned after a long Saturday shift, was approached partway through the evening by Wren, who had apparently been briefed on the doctor's role in the whole story and considered it her personal responsibility to deliver a formal report. "You're the doctor who said the outside thing," Wren announced, without much preamble. "I suppose I am," Dr. Alvarez said, charmed and slightly bewildered. "It worked," Wren said.
"The outside thing."
"We went to the park every single Saturday for 4 years because of what you said, and that's how we found Simon.
So thank you.
You're basically the reason this whole wedding is happening." Dr. Alvarez laughed, delighted and a little overwhelmed. "I'll take that credit," she said. "Though I should warn you, I say a lot of things to a lot of tired parents."
"I had no idea any of it would turn into an entire family."
"Well, it did," Wren said, with the flat, satisfied authority of someone who considered the matter closed, before running off to rejoin her sisters on the dance floor, where Fern was already demonstrating several months of practiced wedding dancing with an intensity that suggested she'd been training for this exact moment her entire life. Theo found Simon near the edge of the dance floor sometime after dark, both of them watching Elena spin the girls, one after another, under the string lights. "I've put ink on a lot of people over 30 years, Theo said. "Most of it disappears into the ordinary noise of a life, the way most things do. I don't get to see how many of those stories end."
"I'm glad I got to see this one."
"You didn't just watch it end," Simon said. "You started it.
Both times.
11 years apart, and you said the exact same thing to two people who'd never met, and somehow that sentence turned out to be true both times, about the same eventual ending." "I just said what I saw," Theo said. "Sometimes you look at a sketch and you can tell exactly how much a person is carrying, and exactly how much they're hoping for on the other side of it, even if they can't say it themselves yet."
"I've said that sentence to a lot of people over the years. This is the only time I've ever gotten to watch it come all the way true."
Late in the evening, once most of the dancing had wound down into quieter conversation and the girls had finally, reluctantly, allowed themselves to be talked into pajamas by Beatrice, Simon found himself alone for a few minutes near the single empty chair he'd placed in the front row, the small card still resting on its seat. His mother, Diane, found him there, and sat down in the chair beside the empty one rather than in it, understanding without needing to be told that the empty chair itself wasn't meant to be occupied. He would have given a terrible best man speech, Diane said, looking at the card. Too long. Too many inside jokes nobody else would understand. He'd have made you cry and made everyone else deeply uncomfortable. Simon laughed, a real laugh, the kind that had grown easier and easier to produce over the preceding year. He absolutely would have. He'd have brought up the time I set my own eyebrow on fire trying to show off with a lighter at 15. In front of everyone. On purpose. He would have, Diane agreed, smiling through what Simon could see were tears held carefully at bay. I'm glad you left the chair. I know some people would tell you it's morbid, at a wedding. I don't think it is. I think it's honest. He's part of this too, whether he's sitting in a chair or not. He's part of why you finished that table instead of falling apart entirely. He's part of the tattoo, even though you drew it years before he died, because I think some part of you always knew, even back then, that you'd eventually need a design that could hold whatever came next, good or terrible. I miss him every day, Simon said quietly. Today especially. I kept looking for him in the crowd without meaning to. Like some part of me still expects him to just show up late, the way he always did, apologizing and making everyone laugh about it. That doesn't ever fully stop, Diane said. The looking. I still do it myself, more than you'd think, after all these years missing your father the same way. You just get better at holding the looking alongside everything else that's also true and good and worth celebrating. Today was both, I think. Grief and joy, sitting in the same chair, more or less, taking turns. They sat together for a while longer in the quiet, watching the last of the string lights flicker gently in the June evening breeze, the reception winding down around them into something soft and unhurried, the particular peaceful exhaustion of a day that had held everything it was supposed to hold. Elena's good for you, Diane said eventually. I could see it the very first time you brought her around. You'd stopped doing the thing you did for 2 years, where you'd answer a question and then go somewhere else in your eyes for a second before coming back. You don't do that anymore. Not since her. I noticed that too, Simon said. I didn't have a word for it until you just said it. But you're right. I think being around her, and around the girls, gave me somewhere to actually land, instead of just circling the same grief over and over. That's the whole thing about landing, Diane said, glancing at the tattoo on his arm, faded now just slightly with 11 years of wear but still perfectly legible. It was always going to happen eventually, once you found the right ground to come down on. I'm just glad I got to watch it happen while I'm still here to see it. They took the girls to the Wisconsin Dells for a week that August, a modest family honeymoon Simon and Elena had agreed on together, understanding that a trip without the 4 girls would have felt incomplete rather than romantic, given how thoroughly the girls had become woven into the foundation of everything they were building together. It was, by any measure, a chaotic week, 4 8-year-olds sharing 2 hotel beds and a rollaway cot, a water park that produced approximately equal parts joy and exhaustion, a running argument about whose turn it was to choose the dinner restaurant that Elena eventually resolved with a rotating schedule posted on the hotel room mirror in dry erase marker. But it was also, Simon found, exactly the kind of trip he hadn't fully believed he'd get to have again after Alec died, the specific, ordinary happiness of a family vacation, complete with sunburns and minor squabbles and the particular contentment of falling asleep exhausted in a room full of people you loved. One afternoon, while Elena took Ivy and Sage to a go-kart track the younger two had declared too scary, Simon found himself alone at the hotel pool with Ren and Fern, watching them practice cannonballs with escalating and occasionally alarming enthusiasm. Can I ask you something? Ren said, climbing out of the pool and settling beside him, dripping and shivering slightly in the late afternoon air. Always. Do you think your brother would have liked us? For real, not just the nice answer. Simon considered the question seriously, the way Ren's questions always deserved to be considered. I think he'd have loved you specifically, he said. You ask the real questions, the ones that actually matter, instead of the polite ones people usually ask. He was like that too. I think you two would have gotten along like a house on fire, honestly, in the best possible way. I wish I could have met him, Ren said.
Me too, Simon said.
But I think you get to know him a little, through the stories. And through the table in the dining room. He helped decide that table needed a fourth coat of oil, the night before he died. Every time you eat dinner at it, you're sitting at something he helped make, even though he never touched the actual wood. Ren considered this with her characteristic seriousness. That's a nice way to still have someone around, she said.
Even after.
It is, Simon agreed.
It's not the same as having him here.
But it's not nothing, either. Fern, who had been listening from the pool's edge, paddled over and rested her arms on the concrete beside them. I think about it sometimes too, she said, arriving as always a beat behind the conversation but landing squarely in the middle of it once she got there.
About my old family.
Before you.
I don't remember Dad living with us, really. I was too little.
But I think about what it would be like if he'd stayed, sometimes.
Do you wish he had? Simon asked gently.
Fern thought about it for a long moment, the particular thoughtful pause that had become, over the year, recognizably hers. I don't know, she said finally. I think if he'd stayed, maybe you wouldn't have found us. And I really like that you found us. So maybe it's okay that it happened the way it happened, even though it was sad for a while. Simon didn't have an immediate answer for that, the particular, unguarded wisdom of an 8-year-old landing somewhere deep and unexpected in his chest. He simply put an arm around her wet shoulders and pulled her close for a moment, and she let him, settling into the embrace with the easy, unself-conscious trust that had, somewhere over the preceding year, become simply how things were between them. I really like that I found you too, he said eventually. All 4 of you. I think about that most days, actually. How strange and lucky the whole thing turned out to be. A year after the wedding, on a bright June Saturday that felt, in its particular quality of light and warmth, like an echo of the day itself, Simon and Elena sat together on the back porch of the house they'd bought together that spring, a modest 3-bedroom in Ravenswood with a yard large enough for the girls, now 9, to have properly claimed as their own private kingdom, and a detached garage Simon had converted into a proper workshop, larger and better equipped than the rented space. Where it had all begun. Do you realize, Elena said, watching the girls chase each other through a sprinkler in the fading evening light, that we've officially been married longer than some of my friends' entire relationships have lasted? Don't jinx it, Simon said, though he was smiling. I'm not jinxing it. I'm just noticing it. A year ago I stood in my mother's backyard and married a man I met because my daughter recognized his tattoo. If I'd read that in a book, I'd have thought it was too neat to be believable. Life's occasionally neater than fiction, Simon said. Fiction has to worry about being believable. Life just has to actually happen. The girls had settled, over the preceding year, into a rhythm with Simon that had stopped feeling like an adjustment and simply become the ordinary texture of their days. Wednesdays remained sacred, workshop afternoons that had evolved, as the girls grew, into increasingly ambitious projects, a proper treehouse the previous summer, a set of matching desks for their bedrooms the winter before that, each one carrying some small individual details Simon worked in specifically for each girl, the way he'd once carved a single letter into the underside of 4 otherwise identical stools. Ivy had grown into her early confidence in ways that made Simon quietly proud, less need to win at everything, more willingness to lose gracefully and try again, a shift Elena attributed, in part, to watching Simon fail at things in the workshop regularly and cheerfully, sanding down a mistake and simply starting again without any of the shame Ivy had once attached to imperfection. Ren still asked the real questions, though her questions had grown more sophisticated with age, less about mechanics and more about meaning, the kind of questions Simon suspected would eventually make her either a philosopher or an extremely effective lawyer, possibly both. Sage remained the quiet observer, though she'd started, over the past year, sharing her observations a little more readily, a little sooner after having them, something Simon privately credited to a slowly accumulating sense of safety that had allowed her private, careful mind to open just slightly wider than it had been before. Fern still ran a beat behind her sisters in most things, still arrived to every conversation and every reaction slightly delayed, but always, without fail, arrived completely, landing in whatever moment she reached with the full, unhurried weight of her genuine presence. I want to show you something, Simon said, once the girls had finally been called in for baths and the porch had gone quiet around the two of them. He rolled up his sleeve, revealing a small addition to the original tattoo he'd done a few months earlier, something he'd kept from Elena as a surprise, tucked discreetly beneath his shirt cuff until now. Around the bird, now clearly at rest, 4 small stars had been added, tiny and precise, arranged in a loose constellation just above where the bird's wings folded closed. "For the girls," he said. "I wanted them permanently part of the story too, not just added on afterward but actually built into the original design, the way they've actually become part of my whole life, not in addition to it." Elena traced the small stars gently with her fingertip. "It's perfect," she said. "It's exactly right." "Theo did it," Simon said. "He came out of retirement for one afternoon, specifically for this. Said he couldn't resist finishing a story he'd started 11 years ago." That same October, 2 years to the week since the original meeting, Simon and Elena returned to Horner Park on a Saturday morning, a small tradition they'd started the previous year without formally naming it as one, a private pilgrimage back to the bench where everything had started, usually just the two of them, coffee in hand, sitting quietly for a while before the girls, now old enough to have their own weekend plans some Saturdays, joined them later for lunch. Desmond had the coffee ready before they even reached the cart, exactly as he always did, extra shot in Simon's without being asked, a tradition that had, if anything, become more deliberate now that both of them understood its full significance rather than less. 2 years, Desmond said, handing over the cups. "You believe that?" "Barely," Simon admitted. They sat on the bench together, watching the same unhurried fall of October leaves, no wind, just gravity, just time doing the only thing time knows how to do. "Do you ever think about what would have happened if we hadn't come to the park that particular Saturday?" Elena asked. "If the girls had wanted to go somewhere else that day, or if I'd been running late, or if you'd decided to skip your usual bench for some reason?" "I try not to think about it too much," Simon said. "It makes my chest hurt a little, honestly. Thinking about how many small things had to line up exactly right for any of this to happen at all." "Priya's Thursdays," Elena said. Dr. Alvarez's offhand comment. Desmond's extra shot. Theo saying the exact same sentence to 2 strangers, years apart. Ren pointing, Simon added. "Out of all 4 girls, out of every single stranger in that park that morning, she's the one who happened to notice, and happened to say something about it instead of just walking past." "I asked her once why she said something," Elena said. "Why she didn't just notice and keep walking, the way most kids probably would have." "What did she say?" "She said it felt rude not to mention it. Like finding out someone has the same rare book as you and just walking past without saying anything. She said it would have felt like keeping a secret that wasn't actually a secret, just an accident of not saying it out loud." Simon laughed, a real laugh, easy now in a way it had taken years to become. "That's about the best explanation for how the entire universe seems to work that I've ever heard. Somebody just decides it would be rude not to mention the thing they noticed, and an entire family gets rearranged because of it." They sat together a while longer, the coffee slowly cooling in their hands, the leaves continuing their unhurried October descent all around the bench, indifferent to the particular significance the two of them had assigned to this exact spot on this exact morning, 2 years running now, and likely, they both silently understood, for every October morning still to come. "I used to come here because it was the only place my mind could go quiet," Simon said eventually. "Now I come here because it's the loudest, most crowded place in my whole memory. Every October leaf falling reminds me of everything that happened because of one particular Saturday." "Good crowded, though," Elena said. "The best crowded," Simon agreed. "I wouldn't trade the quiet for anything. Not for one single second." Simon and Elena didn't set out, consciously, to become the next link in the same kind of chain that had quietly built their own story. It happened, as these things tend to happen, without much deliberate planning at all, simply through the accumulation of small decisions made because they seemed like the right thing to do at the time, with no particular expectation of where they might eventually lead. Elena started, that second autumn, doing for a new neighbor roughly what Priya had once done for her, a young single mother named Corinne who'd moved in 3 houses down with a newborn and a departed partner, and the particular hollowed-out exhaustion Elena remembered intimately from her own hardest year. Elena began showing up on Thursday evenings, unannounced but expected, with a container of whatever she'd cooked that week, and an offer to sit with the baby for 40 minutes so Corinne could shower, or sleep, or simply remember what it felt like to be a single person again rather than the sole operating system for another life. She never framed it as anything significant. She simply knocked on Thursdays and kept knocking, the way Priya had once done for her, understanding now, from the other side of it, exactly how much that consistency had mattered, far more than any single grand gesture could have. Simon, meanwhile, had taken on an apprentice at the workshop that year, a 19-year-old named Marcus who'd shown up one afternoon asking whether Simon needed help sweeping sawdust in exchange for the chance to learn the trade, and who carried, Simon recognized almost immediately, the particular unmoored quality of someone recently and badly hurt by something he wasn't yet ready to discuss. Simon didn't push. He simply gave Marcus real work, real attention, real questions about what he wanted a piece of wood to become, the same patient teaching Theo had once, in his own way, extended to two separate strangers with a sketch and an ache neither of them could fully name. It took Marcus nearly 4 months to mention, one quiet afternoon while sanding a chair leg, that his father had died the previous winter, and that he hadn't told anyone at the shop because he didn't want to be treated differently, didn't want the careful, awkward gentleness people extended to the recently grieving. "I wasn't planning on treating you differently," Simon said. "I figured you'd tell me whatever you wanted to tell me, whenever you were ready, and I'd just keep giving you real work in the meantime. Grief doesn't usually want to be treated differently. It mostly just wants somewhere ordinary to keep existing while it does its slow work underneath." "How'd you get so good at knowing that?" Marcus asked. Simon rolled up his sleeve, revealing the tattoo, now 11 years old, the 4 small stars catching the workshop's afternoon light. "I had some practice," he said. "I lost my brother a few years back. I spent a long time thinking grief needed to be handled carefully, delicately, like something breakable. Eventually I figured out it mostly just needed somewhere ordinary to exist, the same as anything else. A bench in a park. A workshop with sawdust on the floor. A Wednesday that keeps happening whether you're ready for it or not." Marcus studied the tattoo for a long moment. "That's a good design," he said. "What's the story?" "It's a long one," Simon said. "But I've got time, if you want to hear it. It starts with a bench, and 4 girls in matching green coats, and a coincidence that turned out not to be a coincidence at all, once you traced it all the way back." He told Marcus the whole story that afternoon, start to finish, the way he'd eventually tell it to a great many people over the years, to the girls themselves, older now and increasingly curious about the exact mechanics of how their family had come to be, to new neighbors, to Marcus's own eventual partner, years later, who heard the story secondhand and cried at the part about the 4th coat of oil. It occurred to Simon, telling it that particular afternoon, watching Marcus listen with the same rapt attention Ren had once brought to questions about tree rings and courage, that this was probably how all the best chains of kindness actually worked, not through any grand, visible mechanism, but through ordinary people simply passing along whatever had once been passed to them, usually without fully realizing, in the moment, that they were passing anything along at all. 5 years after that first October morning, the girls turned 13 within the same week, as they did every year, a fact that had stopped surprising anyone in the family but still occasionally startled outsiders encountering the quadruplets for the first time, watching 4 nearly identical teenagers argue amiably over whose turn it was to control the car radio. They had grown, as children do, into increasingly distinct versions of the small girls who had once stopped in front of a park bench and changed the shape of 2 adults' lives without any real understanding, at 7, of what they were doing. Ivy had channeled her old need to win into competitive debate, a pursuit that let her argue passionately and successfully about nearly anything, a skill her family had all, at various points, been on the receiving end of with a mixture of pride and mild exhaustion. Ren's real questions had sharpened into a genuine, restless curiosity about the world that had her reading philosophy books meant for people twice her age, and occasionally cornering Simon at dinner with questions about free will and determinism that he did his honest best to engage with rather than deflect. Sage had begun quietly writing, stories she shared with almost no one except, occasionally, Elena, late at night, stories that Elena found, reading them, carried an emotional precision far beyond what she'd expected from a 13-year-old, an ability to notice and name feelings that Sage had apparently been quietly developing behind her characteristic reserve for years. Fern, still arriving a beat behind her sisters in most things, had discovered a genuine talent for photography, and had taken, over the preceding year, to documenting the family's ordinary Wednesdays and Saturdays with the patient, unhurried attention that had always been distinctly hers, building a growing collection of images that Simon suspected, though he'd never said so aloud, would eventually mean more to all of them than almost anything else the family owned. On the actual evening of their birthday, gathered around the walnut table that had, over the years, absorbed 4 13-year-olds worth of homework and arguments and ordinary family dinners alongside its original, quieter purpose, Wren asked the question she'd apparently been saving for the occasion. "Tell us the real story again," she said. "The whole thing, start to finish. Not the short version you tell people at parties. The actual whole thing." Simon and Elena exchanged a glance, the particular look of two people who had told this story so many times over the years, in so many forms, that the telling itself had become its own small tradition. "You've heard it 100 times, Elena said. "I know," Wren said. "I want to hear it again anyway. It's my favorite one." So they told it again, taking turns the way they always did, Simon starting with the bench and the coffee he'd stopped tasting, Elena picking up with the 4 girls in matching green coats stopping in front of him, both of them filling in, over the course of the telling, all the pieces the girls had gradually learned over the years but never tired of hearing again. Priya's Thursdays, Dr. Alvarez's offhand comment, Desmond's extra shot, Theo saying the same 6 words to 2 strangers years apart, the 4th coat of oil on a walnut table, the broken compass finally pointing true. "I still think about how close it came to not happening," Ivy said, when the story finished, the same observation she made nearly every year at this particular telling. "If even one of those small things hadn't happened exactly the way it did." "I think about that too," Simon said. "Every single year, actually, right around this time. It doesn't get less strange to think about, however many times I trace it through." "I think that's the actual lesson," Sage said quietly, the way she delivered her observations, having turned them over privately for a while before finally saying them out loud. "Not that it was fate, exactly. Just that a lot of ordinary people did small kind things without knowing why, and it added up to something enormous eventually. I think that's more useful to believe than fate, actually. Fate means you don't have to do anything. This means every small kind thing you do might matter more than you'll ever know." Simon looked at his daughter, not his daughter by blood, but his daughter in every way that had come to matter over 5 years of ordinary Wednesdays, and felt something in his chest that he still, after all this time, didn't have a fully adequate word for, something built from equal parts pride and gratitude and the specific, quiet wonder of having landed, against every reasonable expectation, exactly where he was always meant to be. "That's exactly the lesson," he said. "I couldn't have said it better myself." They still go back to the bench every October, on the closest Saturday to the anniversary, a tradition now old enough that it no longer needs discussing in advance, simply happening, year after year, the way certain traditions eventually stop being decisions and become instead just the shape a family's calendar naturally takes. 10 years after that first morning, Simon and Elena sat there together again, the girls 17 now, scattered that particular Saturday across their own separate teenage obligations, Ivy at a debate tournament 2 states away, Wren buried in a philosophy essay she'd been agonizing over for a week, Sage at a writing workshop she'd been accepted into after quietly submitting a story without telling anyone, Fern out with her camera documenting a friend's art show. The bench, for the first time in years, held just the 2 of them, the way it had that very first morning, before 4 small girls in matching green coats had rearranged everything. Desmond had retired the coffee cart the previous spring, handing the small business over to his nephew, but he still stopped by most Saturday mornings out of habit, and this particular morning he found Simon and Elena on the bench and sat with them for a while, the 3 of them watching the same unhurried fall of October leaves that had been falling, in some form or another, every single October for as long as any of them could remember. 10 years, Desmond said, shaking his head slowly. "I remember the exact morning. You looked like a man who'd forgotten how his own coffee was supposed to taste." "I had, more or less," Simon admitted. "And now look at you," Desmond said. "Married. 4 kids practically grown. A whole life built out of one Saturday morning and an extra shot of espresso nobody asked me to add." "You added it because you noticed something," Elena said. "That's the whole point, I think. Nobody ever asks to be noticed. The people who matter most are usually the ones who notice anyway, without waiting to be asked." Priya still lived 3 houses down, though her own children had grown and mostly moved out by then, and Elena still saw her most weeks, the friendship having long since outgrown its original context of crisis and mutual survival into something steadier, more ordinary, the particular durable friendship that forms between 2 people who have already proven, once, that they'd show up for each other when it actually mattered. Dr. Alvarez had retired from the pediatric clinic 2 years earlier, but she still received, every October, a card from Elena thanking her for a single offhand sentence delivered years ago between appointments, a sentence she still, by her own admission, couldn't fully remember saying, though she'd long since stopped being surprised by the story's persistence, having come to understand, through Elena's family specifically, how much weight small sentences sometimes secretly carry. Theo had died 3 years earlier, quietly, in his sleep, at 71, and Simon had spoken at his memorial, telling the whole story one more time to a room full of people who'd known Theo mostly as a skilled, quiet craftsman and had no idea, until that afternoon, exactly how large a role he'd played in bringing an entire family into being, simply by looking at 2 separate sketches, years apart, and telling 2 strangers the same true thing about the saddest happy design he'd ever been asked to put on someone's skin. "He'd have liked knowing the ring's still on your hand," Simon said to Elena, that 10th October, both of them thinking of Theo without either needing to say his name first. "Every single day," Elena said, turning the ring so the small worked figures caught the morning light, the compass true, the stem in bloom, the bird finally, permanently, at rest. They sat together a while longer, the leaves still falling in that same unhurried October way, no wind, just gravity, just time doing the only thing time has ever known how to do. Somewhere behind them, a dog moved through a drift of leaves. Somewhere further off, children shouted at a game only they understood the rules of. The park continued at its ordinary volume, the way parks always do, indifferent to the particular weight this exact bench had come to carry for the 2 people sitting on it. And somewhere, perhaps, 4 girls in matching green coats were still walking toward some other bench entirely, in some other version of this same unlikely story, ready to stop in front of some other stranger and say, without any idea of what they were setting in motion, the truest thing they happened to notice. Because sometimes the world really is smaller and stranger and more generous than it appears on any ordinary Saturday morning. And sometimes it uses 7-year-olds to prove it, and coffee vendors, and retired pediatricians, and neighbors who keep knocking every single Thursday long after anyone would have blamed them for stopping, and a tattoo artist who looked at 2 broken hearts, years apart, and told them both the same simple truth, that he'd do it right. He did. All of it, eventually, turned out right.